instructions. I will be interviewing this afternoon Dorothy Teare, who is a charter member of West Shore Unitarian Universalist Church. I'm Janet Tyler. The date now is October the 21st, 1995, and we are in Dorothy's apartment in Rocky River. Dorothy, we start with asking you, where did you grow up, and what was your religious background?
Well, I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, but I grew up in Lakewood. I moved here when I was 5. And as a child, I attended the Presbyterian church because although my father was a Universalist when he grew up in Springfield, Ohio, but my mother thought we should be going to Sunday school, and there was a nice girl in the neighborhood who would take us, and so we went to the Presbyterian church. Do you want my feelings on the subject about that?
Well, yeah. How did you feel about the church of your youth?
The church of my youth. The Presbyterians go in for Bible study a good deal, and I really enjoyed the Bible stories that we studied in that church. They stood me in good stead, and I sometimes feel that our Unitarian church school didn't do enough with the Bible stories, although they began to do more and more, and the youngsters acted them out. Of course, as I grew older, I had many questions about the Presbyterian church.
Yes, so that would tie in with the next question. How was that church, your Presbyterian church, different from Unitarian Universalist?
Well, of course, it was much more orthodox. It believed in the divinity of Christ, which I could not accept. I accepted him as a great teacher, but not as a divine person. And and then there were some other doctrines of the church, which I don't believe they hold now, that seem repellent to me, such as infant damnation. And I don't believe Presbyterians believe that today. But,
no, I don't think they do. Now, if you're a charter member, did you take part in those lecture meetings held in Lakewood Community Center in February and March of 1946?
I certainly did. My good friend Maudwin Metcalf, who's now a member of, also a charter member of the church, had talked to me about Unitarianism in a church she had attended in Chicago. So Wallace and I went to those meetings along with other friends of ours, the Spriggs and so on. We were very much impressed, so much impressed that the next Sunday we went to church over at the First Church on 82nd Street. So
to hear the great Dilworth Lupton.
Yes, I had heard about Dilworth Lupton being an excellent preacher, whom the students at Case Western Reserve seemed to like. And but Dilworth Lupton was not there when we went. You see, he had believed that because the number of Unitarians at the university was so small, it was better to have one strong central church. However, the church that we attended then the pastor was Everett Moore Baker. He had been one of the speakers. He and his assistant, Wayne Chatty, gave the lecture series at Lakewood Community Center. And Everett Moore Baker had felt that the time was come for the word to be spread about Unitarian Universalism. And there were people on the west side who felt that way. Chester and Ruthina Tudbury, I believe, became chairman of a committee of persons who gathered people on the west side to anyone who showed interest in forming a new church. And a lot of us became very much involved in that way.
Would this have been back in the early 40s?
Well, around 45 to 45, I would say.
Now, what role did you play in the formation of West Shore Unitarian Church?
Well, we held meetings in our home for people interested, as did other West Siders, the Spriggs, and so on. I would say that was our most important role at that time.
And before we get into other meetings and the activities, would you want to tell us about your husband, Wally Teare, and his participation in the building of the church?
Well, it became apparent his early participation was chiefly as a handyman. He and Howard Sprigg, who were both of them handy with tools, would be called on whenever there would be a glitch in our operations. But it became very apparent before long that we needed more facilities than we were meeting in the Masonic Temple, you understand, at that time. And we also owned a house on Andrews Avenue, which was called Unitarian House, and the various committees met there. And I was also on committees that met there. And Wallace, I guess you would say, became involved as an architect when it became so apparent that we needed more space and needed a home of our own, because we were all over the Masonic Temple, you know. I'm sure you've heard those tales about our meeting in the ladies' room, the men's room.
No, I haven't, actually.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us about your father and getting the land? I thought that was interesting.
Oh, yes. Well, of course, in order to build, we had to have land. And my father knew about a tax sale coming up on a fine piece of property in Rocky River. So he and the young lawyer, Jay Menwell, went to this tax sale. And it proved to be rather lively because a couple of Cleveland politicians were interested in the property too, and they were bidding. But Dad felt that that property was so valuable that it paid us to stay with it in the bidding and get it. Jay sort of panicked, but Dad said, "Be quiet, I think we can do it." And ultimately they outbid the politicians and we got the property, and did prove a wise move, as we know.
That's great.
Faith. I'm going to change this camera. That's good. Okay.
Is the sound off now?
No, go ahead.
Shall I go ahead? They ask you to describe the first summer between the first annual meeting in May 1946 and the first service in September 1946. What activity took place?
It was a summer of planning, you know, and acquiring a faculty, you might say, a group of teachers, and then finding space, which of course was the Masonic Temple at first. But it was also a summer of anxiety. How many people really will turn out for it? Well, we have enough for the church. But I think something like 125 people turned out that first Sunday. So.
Oh, nice.
Yes.
And you met where again?
In the Masonic Temple.
Masonic Temple in Lakewood.
In Lakewood, yes. Yeah. I had some recollection of a meeting in the YMCA in
Lakewood.
In Lakewood, but it's very vague, and it may have been for another set of meetings rather. But all of our main meetings were in the Masonic Temple those early years.
Were there any open houses held in the summer of 1945? I think you mentioned.
Oh, yes.
There were plenty of
yes,
houses.
We had, well, I think I told you about I didn't know whether I should serve refreshments or not. I didn't know whether it was proper or not, you know, at this churchly gathering. But so I didn't. I just served cold water, and afterwards, when Bob Thompson teased me about that, that was delicious water you had. So after that, I held meeting, we did serve simple refreshment.
What are your reflections or recollections about early board activities? Were you an officer?
I was on the board, but I don't believe I was an officer. But the board met frequently because there were so many problems that beset it, you know. So there was a lot of activity.
Can you give an example of just a couple of the early problems that you tackled?
I think the church school was the biggest problem, accommodating the children. Finding the classrooms for them and be sure that there were enough teachers and enough backup teachers. The problems with the adults were not so great, you know, it was mostly listening to lectures.
Yes, I can understand that. How much time per week did you spend on church activities during the early years?
Well, of course, I was busy every Sunday, and then there'd be some time preparing for it during the week, and usually going to a meeting or two. We had a lot of RE meetings, of course, during that time.
Now, you have children, of course.
Yes.
Dick and Virginia.
Two.
And how important was religious education in your family?
Well, it became very important. And I had been doing, I was being a renegade from the Presbyterian Church, and from the Episcopal, although neither of us had been members of those churches. We had been doing quite well without any church until it came to the children, and we felt we wanted something from them. Well, in fact, we wanted something more in our own lives, too. Something that we hadn't gotten, you know, in our old churches. And so we were all ready for it. But the children were quite a primary interest.
And that's certainly understandable, Dorothy. Describe your participation in the RE program. Did you teach or did you write curriculums?
I taught. As I remember one course I taught on the Bible. I taught it as a library of books, not just one book, a library of books. You know, I would bring some books and put them on the table or desk, whatever we had, and would say, now there's a book of poetry here, and a book of history, and a book of songs, and a book of battles, because there were some fierce battles, and a book about famous men, and I would, mention Jesus. We had a textbook called Jesus the Carpenter's Son, which I did not teach, but it was, there was a book about the great man Jesus and about some great men called prophets, and they're all right here in this one book called the Bible. But it's really not just one book, it's many books.
Mm-hmm.
And they seem to like that.
What other activities did RE sponsor?
They sponsored this brotherhood group that I think I have told you about in private. That was a group of young people from our church, from a Jewish temple, from a black church, and later on a more conventional church, the United Brethren Church, who asked to join us because they liked what we were doing. This program was set up by Jean Marshall, a social worker in our church. And I became involved in it through her, chiefly on the writing end of it. I worked with the students, and we worked out what we call choral readings. That is, we would take a subject and write dialogue for individuals and then for the group to speak in unison. And we sang songs and so on. And we appeared on, every time we had a program, Jean would arrange for us to go on television, and we were on television. But I'm supposed to be doing a separate thing on that, so we shouldn't spend too much time on that.
Now, what did your children like or not like about the church?
Well, they liked most everything about it. They liked being with the other children. They liked acting out the Bible stories. As when we got around to doing that, I remember Dick particularly enjoying being Moses and attacking the wicked overseer. He did that with great flourish.
Ah, that's cute. From your point of view, would you assess the effectiveness of, we'll start with the ministers, Everett and Moore Baker?
Well, he was a very charismatic person, and a very good speaker, and a very warm, outgoing kind of person. And did I say that Dilworth Lupton had the idea of just one church because we were small in numbers? Well, Everett Moore Baker believed in expansion, moving out to more people. And he was the one to do it because he was so charismatic.
Well, we're glad he did. And Wayne Chattee?
Well, Wayne was his assistant and was very young, very youthful, very enthusiastic. And kids loved him, you know. He would fly around the church in his black robe, and the children called him Batman.
And Peter Sampson?
Peter Sampson was an excellent platform speaker. He didn't have quite the connection with the people that Everett Moore Baker did, but he was a brilliant mind and spoke out on important topics and received a lot of coverage in the papers, Plain Dealer.
That was good.
Papers.
And Jim Curtis?
Jim Curtis was an earnest young man that I was very fond of, but somehow or other he got off on the wrong foot with some people. I don't quite know why, but it was a rather sad period in the church. But and eventually he resigned, but got a very nice church in Washington. Unfortunately, he did not have good health, and he served several years in Washington, but then later died of a liver complaint.
And David Cole?
David Cole was a fine scholar, knew his subject very well, and had a good sense of humor, and a lovely wife, Iska, who won the heart of the congregation, and they were a very good couple. We admired David's scholarship, and he had an interesting personality.
And now we have Michael McGee.
Michael McGee, yes, who can charm the birds off the trees, and it has other qualities besides.
Now, the question next is, describe your impressions of the early physical quarters of the church.
Well, the Masonic Temple, we used every part of it, but it was very difficult because there would be dances the night before, and that meant there had to be a committee to do a cleanup, you know, and a setup for church, and so it was far from ideal. It was good in that it was centrally located and a nice building, but we had to use the little parish house of the Swedenborgian church across the way for the overflow church school.
Mm-hmm. When the first permanent building at Hilliard and Northview was completed, what was the early building like? Was it adequate?
No, it was almost inadequate from the very beginning because it just wasn't big enough, you know. And it's what is now Baker Hall. It was, of course, named for Everett Moore Baker. No, it wasn't adequate, and very soon we had to add a wing to it, and I think twice we added wings. Yes, there was the Chattee wing, yes, which is now the Chattee wing, was an addition. And there was a church school wing. And it was very soon apparent that we needed a real building. So we got to work. We had a building fund, and we got to work on it. And while it was being built, we moved over to Rocky River City Hall, that is the adult church moved to City Hall. And the church school moved to Goldwood Church, which we rented from the Rocky River Board of Education.
Now, how much of the work was done by volunteers?
Oh, as much as possibly could be. And there were a lot of willing volunteers.
Now it says, what colors...
They were consulted. Wallace consulted them a lot on what they wanted in the church, you know. And what they wanted, they were willing to help on as a rule.
Mm-hmm. they want to know what colors were used on the inside of the building. All those early photos are black and white, so they don't know what the colors were.
I really don't remember about the colors. Green, of course, was used on the carpeting and the
I think the brick
pads
on the
for
outside
pews,
is nice, the green.
And the blue, of course, the outside was blue.
Mhm.
The great blue whale, as it was called.
Is that what?
Did you know that story?
No.
Well, the community was very interested in the church in its rather unusual shape.
Mm-hmm.
And at the curved driveway, at the beginning, all the small cars, the Toyotas, were allowed, and other small cars were allowed to park, or were supposed, in fact, to park in that semicircle. And so some people called it the Toyota factory, and other people called it, because of its shape, the great blue whale giving birth.
That's very funny. I think they've gotten over that, because I have
No, they don't talk about it.
Well, then the next question you have really answered. What was the reaction of the community to this new church? The great blue whale giving birth?
Well, they were intrigued by it, shall we say.
What are your recollections of early fundraisers?
Well, we did all sorts of things, of course, as fundraisers. Some people gave bridge parties, other people gave garden tours, had staged garden tours.
Yes.
And we had fundraising dinners, of course. Well, just about every kind of fundraising that you could think of.
Now, describe some of the more memorable guest speakers or church programs or at a Sunday services that you can remember.
Well, I know we were very good. We were fortunate in being able to entertain or to obtain leaders of the community as speakers in our pulpit. We had a number of them. As I say, community leaders of all sorts, but the out-of-town speaker that I remember the most was A. Powell Davies, who was a powerhouse in Washington. His sermons were broadcast and were responsible for the growth of a number of small churches in the suburbs around Washington. And he was a power with the established churches in Washington, the more conventional churches. It was he who broke the race barrier in the Washington restaurants. He succeeded in getting, of course, all of the Unitarian churches and a number of the mainline churches to go along with him on a boycott of restaurants that refused to serve blacks. And the boycott was effective, and that barrier was broken down. And he was given the credit for it. So naturally, and he had a wonderful Welsh accent, which we all enjoyed hearing.
Now, how would you characterize those early congregations? Diverse, professionals, middle class?
Middle class and a lot of professionals. We had so many men from NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space. A lot of NASA members.
That's interesting.
And people looking at our congregations would say, "You had so many men. Most churches, they're mostly women."
Well, I suppose that's largely true.
Uh-huh.
Now, during those early days, how did the West Shore relate to other churches in the community, to other UU churches?
Well, there weren't so many other UU churches. There was one in North Olmsted, and we had good relations with them. And our relations with the other churches, I would say, was friendly. We used to. I remember we invited the Lutheran ladies across the street to tea, and and then when the Rocky River churches formed, a Rocky River Church Association, and set up a series of dinners in the different churches. We were very active in that. We entertained them. We went to their churches. We went to the St. Christopher's I remember speaking in St. Christopher's. I can't understand it because St. Christopher's had a program in which they asked each church to send a representative to speak in to tell something about their church and its work. And
do you recollect what you spoke to the ladies in St. Christopher's about?
It wasn't just the ladies. It was all of the churches of Rocky River. It was one of their meetings.
Uh-huh.
Well, I think I tried to tell them something about our beliefs.
That's
and
very
mentioned some of the
interesting. I wish they
famous
had more.
Unitarians.
Mm-hmm.
I remember one person just got up and recited the Apostles' Creed, and that annoyed our hosts, the Catholics. They said that they had expected everybody, they thought knew that, but they expected something a little more unique, I guess. Oh, you gave it to them, I guess.
Dorothy, is there anything else that you'd like to bring up that we haven't covered about the Unitarian Church, the early days or the way it is now? Do you think it's changed a lot from 50 years ago when you and Wallace and the other people started? Do you think things in the church have changed?
Well, of course, there are many more young people, and I think their influence is stronger than, of course, older people, which is probably also the good. I think we're about as active as we are. I'd like to see more young people involved in our social action, but I think that is growing. And of course we're a bigger church now, and with the problems of a large church. But by and large, I think we've kept our spirit, our human vigor. I remember Susanna's rector, my sister-in-law, was my Episcopal week, has lived with me and now lives across the hall from me. Is Episcopalian, and her rector frequently calls, and he remarks all the time about that the youthful vigor of your church.
Yes, I noticed that in the church, the youthful vigor. I don't know all the programs they're in.
Yes.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think maybe I...
Dorothy, you've been a leader of the social concerns, a spearhead and a shotgun, the social concerns committee for years and years. What started your interest in that?
Oh, our social concerns meetings on the first Tuesday of the night of the month. And for a long time I was the United Nations chairman of the church. And
But what in your background started the interest in social concerns?
what was that?
You grew up in Lakewood and so forth. What started your interest in social concerns per se?
Well, it was these lectures that I went to in the Lakewood Community Center that got a number of us really interested. We were looking, I guess, really for a church. And of course, that's one of the beauties of the church. It brings together people from diverse backgrounds, We have...
It's the freedom.
Yeah, the freedom.
I don't know if we're still on...
One of our...
Whether you're still... It's the freedom of the church that...
One of our most active couples one was raised an Orthodox Jew, and the other was raised as Catholic in Ireland. And they have found a meeting place in our church. And that is a good thing about it.
That's great. Well, I can say that this ends my interview with Dorothy Teare, and thank you very much, Dorothy.
Oh, I think you are a very good interrogator, shall we say.
Well, these are Carol Jacobs' ideas and questions, and I think they're very good. Oh, then the Daytime Alliance has been around a long time.
Oh, yes. They met at Unitarian House. That house was very important in our growth because it was a meeting place. You see, we couldn't use the Masonic Temple during the week. It was just rented on Sunday. So Unitarian House was a beehive of activity.
Well, Alice Ellers was telling me that the Evening Alliance became the Day Alliance.
Oh, really?
That's what she said, as though there wasn't any Day Alliance until the Evening Alliance.
Well, the
And
Day
Rose-
Alliance was older women, and they may have sort of died out.
Died out, I see. In other words, maybe they weren't
Yes.
there, and but Alice Ellers and her sister came in 1971. That is, they came into the church. And
I think that's what happened, the Day Alliance.
kind
I
of,
guess there's now just the one alliance, maybe.
there's just the one alliance, and according to Alice, and she should know because she was in the Evening Alliance, she worked, and her sister Rose, and she said the Evening Alliance became the Day Alliance.
Yes, so well, they were all older women in my mother's age.
And some of them are older now, like Barbara Van Roden.
Yes.
And,
But they merged and became one alliance.
yeah, they became, yeah.
But the Day Alliance.
But there's so much going on. They have this PSI thing, and
Oh,
they have the
yes.
humanist group, and
We didn't have that
do you
many
know
groups.
Universe Christ? Universe Christ
I know
was the
her.
president of the Women's Committee of the Great Lakes
Yes.
Festival. She sits in front of me when I go down to the festival matinees. And she said she would join the humanist group. Her father was a Unitarian, and he named her Universe.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And I know Universe very well,
She
too.
told me, well, I started going this summer to the services, and I saw Universe sitting there, so I went over to her.
I never asked her about
And
it.
we talked about the church, and she said, well, of course, I grew up being a
Well, did you grow up
Unitarian.
as a Universalist? The Universalist theory, is all the universal salvation of all souls,
Sure.
and then not believe in hell.
Oh, heavens, no.
And that they used to say in the small towns, the universalism spread to rural areas. Unitarianism was more city. The joke about Unitarians believe in the Fatherhood of God, the Brotherhood of Man, in the neighborhood of Boston.
Yeah, that's cute.
And the Universalists were in rural and small town churches like Springfield, Ohio, where my father grew up. It was a Universalist church.
Yeah.
And they used to say that the bell in the Universalist church was ringing, no hell, no hell.
No heaven either when you get right down to it. It better be heaven here or else. Well, it's very stimulating, the church. Oh, Dorothy, I came in too late to get that trip to England. Did you go, Bill?